My name is Killian Baker, and this is my Least We Forget project in History 1301, Section 409. This is the introduction. It gives you the project instructions, who I chose as my political figure, and why I chose my figure, the biography I chose to base this research off of, and the credibility sources of that particular biography, and why my historical figure is a lesser-known historical figure. I decided to do my project on George Mason, also known as the Forgotten Founder. George Mason's early life. He was born in 1725. His ancestors made a very comfortable lifestyle as planners, and he was introduced into a high-end lifestyle from a very young age, and his family name was often used alongside of Washington's and Lee's. His father died in a boating accident when he was very young, and his mother, Anne Thomas Mason, enlisted the help of his uncle John Mercer to raise him. Mercer would actually become George Mason's guardian. Mercer was an avid book collector and a very successful lawyer, and he had one of the best libraries in this part of the world at this time. And George Mason would spend most of his time in there reading and just going over all these books. And one particular book that Mason favorited and dove into frequently was Of Every Man His Own Lawyer. George Mason was married to Anne Elbeck on April 4th, 1750, and they had 10 children together. Anne Elbeck would die later on in life, and George Mason would remarry at the age of 54. Gunston Hall is the home that George Mason had built thanks to the help of William Buckland, who was George Mason's brother's servant, and was lent to George Mason by his brother to help build Gunston Hall between 1755 and 1758. And Gunston Hall was a different type of home that was being built typically in those days, with a direct basement door so that you can move precious cargoes in and out discreetly, and had 3 extra windows on the south for extra ventilation. And George Mason was so impressed with William Buckland's work that he actually granted his freedom after the building of Gunston Hall. And when George Mason was having Gunston Hall built, the only thing he had in mind was for it to be as hospitable as possible. Now, George Mason's medical problem, he was crippled by gout throughout his days, and he often was bedridden for days on end because of it. He would routinely look for treatments such as bleeding and ginseng. When there were laws in Congress or debate, he would often be down at the apothecaries picking up remedies or things he could take to help his gout. And bleeding is when they would cut open a vein, let the blood drain out into a bowl, or they'd stick leeches all over you and get that bad blood out. His political career, he was always reluctant to take public office, and in fact, Mason told his sons to shun public service unless the necessity of the times called them forth to transmit their posterity those sacred rights to which they themselves were born. And that's on Robert A. Rutland's biography on page 42. In fact, the House of Burgess spot that he accepted in 1759 was his highest public spot held, besides his spot in the Constitutional Convention. Mason was elected a delegate at the Richmond Convention in 1775, and he often worked from before breakfast until adjournment at 5 o'clock. He'd eat a quick dinner. He'd work by candlelight with his colleagues for the rest of the night, and he was oftentimes referred to as an old workhorse. And this was the type of work that Mason was oftentimes trying to avoid doing by going into public office. And he took the fall and winter of 1755 and 1756 to really decide if he wanted to go back. And when he did decide to go back in 1776, he was the main appointee for writing the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the proposal for new government. At the Richmond Convention of 1776, Mason had to postpone his departure due to gout, and he finally arrived around May 15, 1776, and there was no government at Richmond at this time. But as soon as he did arrive, he found out that a resolution had been passed that the delegates in Philadelphia were to vote the colonies as free. So once he arrived, he was immediately added to the committee tasked with drafting a Bill of Rights and a new plan of government, even though Archibald Carey was the chairman, but it was Mason who dominated the committee. And again, that's a direct quote from Robert A. Rutland's biography on page 49. Now, the job of drafting concrete proposals for new government fell to Mason because he was qualified by background. No man knew more about colonial charters or what the law book said about rights and proper constitution, and also because Mason understood the importance of it and the need to get on with the project at once without a lot of useless wasting of time over proposals and procedures. And again, that is a direct quote from Rutland's biography on page 49. And the biggest debate that took place during this time was over Mason's line of the Declaration of Rights that read, "All men are created equally free and independent," and this was the biggest debate due to slavery. And George Mason was openly questioning slavery since 1765. The eventually agreed upon line read that all men by nature are equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights of which they enter into a state of society they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity. And the italicized wording in that is referring to the slaves and how they're not members of society but merely pieces of property at this point. And while George Mason was waiting for the third reading of his proposed Virginia Declaration of Rights, he was still hard at work on the Constitution to follow. And finally, on June 12, 1776, just 4 weeks after the appointee of the committee, the Virginia Declaration of Rights was passed. Following the Richmond Convention in 1776, before the third reading of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, the entire Atlantic coast had already known what it had said. It had been published numerous times. And thanks to George Mason, all the eyes were on Virginia for them to pass this so that they could follow suit and have something to base their governments and declarations off of. Mason was strongly insisted on taking an available seat for the Virginia delegate in the Constitutional Convention of 1777, but he denied it, saying that he was having health issues. And it wasn't until 1780 that George Mason would return to the capital at Richmond. Oftentimes when George Mason was there, he would envision his retirement and he yearned for it, and that's all he really wanted to do. Due to this, he put political offices and opportunities at the back burner, and come 1783, he was now to learn that personal aloofness robbed his advice of authority, and that's a direct quote again from Robert A. Rutland's biography on page 75. It wasn't until early 1783 that he made up his mind that he would return. And when Mason was reached out to in regards to the new Constitution that was being drafted, the proposal was for a two-branched legislature proportionately representing the population. And Mason's proposal of the Virginia Constitution was the modern-day three-branch government. By May 26th, there were enough members there to start, and George Washington was elected president over the convention. Madison had an outline of Mason's Virginia delegation that outlined the judicial, legislative, and executive branches of government. In 1787, before the end of the Constitutional Convention, George Mason proposed that there be a Bill of Rights added to the beginning of the Constitution, and it was denied. On June 8th, 1789, James Madison amendments to the U.S. Constitution that mirrored George Mason's Declaration of Rights that he wrote in 1776. And on August 24th, 1789, the House passed 17 amendments to be added to the Constitution. They took it to the Senate. The Senate took it from 17 down to 12. They condensed it. And then Congress approved it on September 25th, 1789, and sent it out to the states for approval. And finally, after all of this, on December 15th, 1791, Amendments 3 through 12 were ratified and added to the Constitution and are now known as the Bill of Rights. So why is he not remembered? George Mason was always very reluctant to take public office. He never wanted to be the one in the limelight. He never wanted to be the one getting recognition. He wanted to be the one behind the scenes making everything work. And he wanted to live out his days at Gunston Hall, and I think that got the best of him. And due to this mindset, he had his priorities as his home, his state, the South, and then the Union. So that made it clear, and I think had his priorities been different, he'd be well more known than he is today. Now, the legacy of George Mason, he's the father of the Bill of Rights. He is the person that initially submitted that document and the one that everything is based off of now, and I'm glad that he got to see the day that the first 10 amendments were added to the Constitution of the United States before he died. And I think a lot more people need to know the backstory of that Bill of Rights and how this ordinary man who was self-taught, and yes, he might have had, a little bit easier in life with money, but he was self-taught, self-made, and he was a workhorse. He put in the work, and it paid off. He got what he wanted, and he made sure that the people of this new country had their freedoms and their outlined rights that could not be taken away from them. This is my works cited up top. The very first one is my biography that I used, again, for the bulk of this research. And the rest below that are actually the pictures I used throughout the slideshows.